This podcast is brought to you by Humans, the next generation HRIS supporting distributed organizations globally.
Shaun, thanks very much for taking the time and joining me today.
Thanks,
How are you doing?
Giovanni. I'm good. Nice to be in London for a day.
Amazing, fantastic. So before we jump straight in, perhaps you can give us some context around who you are, what you do, and how you ended up in the wonderful world of people, HR, and business in general.
Yeah, I guess since the last 2 months, I'm an ex-chief people officer. Wind back to the beginning, which seems a long time ago now, but I was a retailer by trade. My formative years were spent in Marks and Spencer, then on to the Kingfisher Group, and now defunct electrical retailer in the UK called Comet that was part of the Kingfisher Group. And those early years, very much cross-functional, spreading myself across retail operations, category management, but of course retail businesses are hugely people-centric. From my early days of managing shop floors and stocking shelves at Christmas in preparation for peak. And I guess that was my early, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess my early moments of understanding the importance people play in driving a business. I often tell a story, the early days at Marks and Spencer. I joined on their management training program. I'm back in the day, late 1980s, 1989, so a long time ago. It was a very traditional business, and you were viewed as management from the day you started, management in quotes. And in those very early days, having to manage, lead some really experienced in-store colleagues with 20, 30 years service. And you very quickly learn the importance of how you communicate, how you engage with those people to get things done. Because quite clearly, Giovanni, I knew very little about leadership. I was 18. Some great stories from those days, being asked to pick the wine at a separate management dining table. Those days feel an alien concept now. But they were the early connections with people. I think retail also gives you some really great commercial fundamentals early in your career. Retail early. My early year Comet post-university, a range of marketing, category management roles, commercial roles, some early exposure to the HR function. I worked in management development, and then after looking at retail strategy and productivity, straight into a pretty big people leadership role, looking after what we now call people operations, what we then called colleague services, which we'll dive into.
In a second.
But also the reward agenda as well. So being from a commercial background, really early exposure to incentivization, reward, commission in a sales environment. Then on to Compass, biggest outsourced caterer in the world. A slight pivot, still a service industry, but less sort of productized and more around mainly food, but also facilities management, outsourcing of all sorts of types of facilities, security, across a range of sectors, business and industry, big sports stadiums like Twickenham. Great 3 years at Compass, thoroughly enjoyable. And then I guess the first pivot, my first sort of slight frustration with traditional corporate life, and I had a period from 2012 to 2017 where I worked for myself for the first time. I worked with some really cool clients. It was my first exposure to technology, media, and sport. I was fortunate to work with a company called Stats Perform. They were Perform Group at the time, who provided sports data and services to the betting industry, to the media industry. I also traveled a lot. I also worked very flexibly. I followed my passion of playing professional poker alongside traveling for a few years. But it really introduced me more, I guess, to the world of D2C, digital, online businesses, very, very different to retail. And Stats Perform ultimately became DAZN. And in 2017, I was asked to go and help the scaling of a very early stage startup, a different startup, because it was obviously very well funded by Access Industries. And I had 5 great years at DAZN, ending up as Chief People Officer. Made a decision to do something different in 2022. And for the last 2 years, I was at a Romanian unicorn called Superbet, Blackstone backed, another very successful scaling. betting organisation that has aspirations to do more than betting, until the middle of this year, where again I made another conscious choice to do something different, and we'll see where that path takes me over the next 5-10 years.
Amazing. Thanks very much for sharing lots of interesting stories that we can dive into. Maybe one area where you can start. We're going to touch today on the aspects of leadership team, building leadership teams. I know you're very passionate about growing capabilities within teams and skills. Perhaps we can start there on the first building block. One question that I have for you, where I would love to get your perspective as we start, is how do you think about building the right leadership team composition, especially for organizations that are going through a phase of rapid growth?
Yeah, look, I think the first step starts with operating model. So I think you have to be clear on what is your operating model, right? What are the core areas of capability? How do they fit together? What are the processes? What are the supporting areas of functional expertise? And once you're clear on that operating model, you can be much clearer on the suite of roles you need around your exec table. I think that suite of roles then gives you some core requirements around functional expertise and capabilities. So, a CMO needs to have expertise in, performance marketing, CRM, customer journeys, brand, etc. And I think that almost becomes your baseline then, right? So they're your hygiene factors. There are some functional spikes. I then think it's about saying, in each of those areas, what are the superpowers that relate to that stage of the journey? So when you go to market, there's almost a minimum bar that your candidates will reach, but you spend all of your time during that hiring process of focusing on the superpowers, not the hygiene factors. I think having that clear up model and structure at the beginning is really, really important, because then you can sweat the things that matter, which are the things that make those people unique and different.
How do you think about specific capabilities across the leadership team? Like what we have seen in the last few years, obviously, again, you need to adjust, you need to adapt, incredible level of change. If we look specifically, let's say at the 2021, where companies were hiring at incredible pace, we've seen a number of perhaps bad leadership calls on we want to bring incredible number of talent into organization, sometimes where you don't even have a clearly defined role for certain talent. And what ended up happening there is you actually dilute the talent density. And that obviously had an impact on company performance when actually say, okay, we're not producing at the level that we expect. Now we need to scale back. How do you avoid that? How do you think about bringing the right leaders with the right skills? They can navigate through these decisions and then ultimately, make sure the company stays in, the best possible shape.
I think there's a couple of parts to that question. I think, the ramp in hiring that we saw, you're absolutely right. There's an impact on talent density. And clearly talent density is diluted when you scale. It's human nature that to keep raising the bar when you have volume gets worse. I think one of the other big impacts is almost creating work, which comes back to the op model, where you're not sure of the value that work's creating, and it almost becomes self-fulfilling, Giovanni. We saw some of this at DAZN. Most people want to stay busy, right? So the more people you hire, the more work that's created. And quite often, as you scale,
it's not necessarily the work that you would want them to do.
Well, it's not, exactly. And it comes back to your thing about leadership capability then, because those leaders, they have to be close to the output and questioning, what difference is this piece of content creation or this piece of product development actually having on our core purpose and our op model? So I think your point's really well made, and it comes back to having leaders, I think, that can spike down into the detail at that period of rapid growth, but spike back up again, to make sure that where you are investing in more people and more technology and more products, it's having the impact you want it to have. And you come back to your point around, skills around the leadership table. I think if you're clear on those functional expertises that you need, and they almost become a hygiene factor. What you're looking for around the leadership table then is diversity of thought, the ability to challenge, some of those superpowers on strategic breadth or on execution capability. So as a team, the functional stuff's almost a given. You have to trust me as a CPO that I can deliver the core elements of a people strategy. I have to trust my CMO that he can deliver a performance acquisition strategy and a CRM and customer journeys. I have to trust my chief product officer that they're going to build great products. What becomes important then are those sort of leadership characteristics that sit above that functional capability. So there's challenge in the exec room. There's a confidence to call people out on the way we're doing things, the speed at which we're moving, and some of those hiring decisions we talked about.
How do you think in the context about fit versus alignment?
That's a great question.
Lots of companies always think about, okay, we need to bring leaders that kind of fit the culture that we build, what we created. Although culture, we know well they can evolve pretty rapidly, also together with the company, versus focusing specifically on we have these business goals, objectives, and want to make sure the team that we have is massively aligned around that. So how would you think about
I've always struggled with the term cultural fit. It sort of takes me back to the 90s and the early 2000s. And as you said, fit by its very nature suggests we're going to take this unique individual that has their own set of superpowers and skills and make them fit in our organization, which is a pretty flawed concept. And I think, as you said, alignment's a much better term around saying, at this stage of our evolution, what type of people are going to be able to do their best work in this organization? And I think that starts with the hiring process, Giovanni, as well. I think one of the most important things is you can paint those pictures of what this organization feels like, what it needs at this moment in time, what are the big commercial challenges, customer challenges, and help an individual understand, is this a place where they can do their best work? We've all had headhunt calls where you get the classic pitch about an organization and why you should come here. And it's not always a truly accurate picture. And I think that's the first learning. I think almost it's basic customer service, set a realistic expectation and then exceed it. So I think
picture painted.
Yeah, and I think painting those pictures, I probably put a disproportionate amount of time to managing those relationships with search partners, prospective candidates, to paint those accurate pictures of what's needed in an organization. So I think that's a really important part of the process.
One of the big challenge that I see with company is you might have a specific hiring goal or hiring target. Let's say we have a gap in our leadership team that we need to fill. Let's say we need to get our next CMOs, and you want to fill the role as fast as possible. But sometimes it's just very hard because identify the right person for the job is challenging. So how do you think about making those decisions in a way that is rapid, but without having kind of, negative impact on the company? Because we all went through, the phase of, I brought into the business the wrong leader, and it was painful and it was expensive. And now we need to kind of, fix some of the issue that, happened there. So how do you think about that? How do you advise?
Look, I think the biggest challenge is to try and not find yourself in that position. Which I know is a cliche, and I think it goes back to predicting where you'll need a change in capability or where an individual's potentially at risk, and having that trust in the relationship that you don't get these surprises. I think you've then got more time to proactively pipeline talent. One of the early things we did after, I think I can talk about this, after Shai joined DAZN, was we went and did a big talent mapping exercise with that specific role in mind, where we got a really good understanding of different types of skills in the media industry, in commercial roles, in marketing roles, to start conversations when actually there was no immediate need. So you have the ability to develop relationships with potential candidates, understand how they could support your plan. So that speed at which you can move
when the time
is much
right,
quicker when the time's right. And I think it's difficult to do that all the time, but I think having one eye on the market and staying close to the talent and having open conversations about your organization helps you preempt those problems and move more quickly.
How do you see ownership there? Is something that, again, you as a chief people are nurturing those relationships, or is about connecting, the CEO with another potential senior exec, or like, bringing together a leadership team to kind of, share some of this conversation? How would you nurture that the right way?
I think the first thing is being close to your leadership team, and having continual conversations around how your leaders are performing, where there could be an opportunity in 3-4 months' time, where you think someone is potentially at the point of pivoting and doing something different in their career. And I think if you have that insight and knowledge early, it's about all of the above then. It's about seeing every opportunity, whether that's a networking event, a client meeting, proactively doing works with search partners to look at the market, to almost have conversations, talk about your brand, talk about your business, to be ready to sort of move much more quickly when you have a gap to fill. Of course, you'll have times when you don't have time. And I think then it comes down to the level of talent density you've got beneath and how you take bets to continue running your business and not be forced into a quick decision on the wrong hire. And having that sort of contingency plan that, okay, if person X is going to leave, how do we run the business for 3, 4, 5 months to ensure we've got continuity and make sure we're not rushing? And of course, you've always got options like interim solutions. But it's much better if you can have that continuity internally.
100%. One thing that we observe in general in the industry, when you look at the different type of leaders that you have, you look at engineering, sales, marketing, and then the people leader is their background. Usually the journey is relatively linear in, again, engineering, sales, and marketing. But when you look at the HR people leader, is is a blend of different experiences. Like, there's no specific pattern that would emerge. So, and that, I believe, that could have actually an impact on the type of skills that you have in there. What's your view on the journey of a people leader, and in general the capabilities of this leader, and how they can actually have an impact on the organization?
It's really interesting. I met an ex-colleague earlier today, and we were talking about this subject area. I think it's much less common to see people in big people leadership roles that have worked across a business. I think historically, some of the supermarkets did it very well. Back in the day, Tesco's did it very, very well. That you had to see a number of different functions. If you were going to sit on the exec team, you had to have spent 2 years running a store portfolio, seen 2 different functions. I think the best people leaders I've worked with are those that have either experienced running a P&L, experienced some time in marketing, or at least they've been curious about how business operates. Because there's huge breadth to the role. Leadership development to reward, to people operations, to talent acquisition. They're very different sets of capabilities that you need. So I think the best people leaders for me have sort of stepped outside their comfort zone. There's a couple that I've worked with. Robin Mills comes to mind, who runs Compass UK and Ireland now, who's not a traditional HR practitioner. He's stepped out of the people arena to understand the impact of those decisions. So I think that's a continuing challenge in the people world with the next generation of CPOs. How do we give them more breadth early in their career?
Do you think there are challenges in attracting top-tier talent into HR and the people space specifically?
Yeah, I think there is. Yeah. I think some of that's perception-led. Some of it actually is CEOs not making big bets and taking risky decisions because they see it as a much safer bet to have someone that can run the core elements of HR, that has the right reference points. And then I think you've got the early career journeys as well. It's generally not as attractive to many people as a product career or a marketing engineer, a marketing career or an engineering career. So I think there's a lot more we can do to promote the breadth of the roles and the interest of them.
I believe that when we look at your career specifically, you had someone that basically placed a bet on you earlier on. So, and I'm a little bit curious to kind of dive a little bit into that and what that kind of meant for you specifically, the impact of the bet and how you think about in general betting on people that might have incredible potential but not an obvious, CV background. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, my story, if I go back to the late 1990s, I spent a period of time after a graduate scheme working in retail strategy, retail productivity. So, how do we look at face time in a store selling electrical products? How do we get more customer interaction, improve our productivity, give a better level of service? And that area crossed retail ops. It crossed some training, some development skills, and I'd done quite a good job there. I'd only spent 12 months prior to that in what you'd call a traditional HR role. I'd worked as a management development advisor on, how we attract retail talent and how we assess them, but a very, very short period of time. And a new chief people officer, HR director, took a bet on me very, very early. With my sort of commercial retail productivity background, they offered me the chance to lead colleague services, what we now call people operations, and the reward agenda, which in a highly commission-led environment was quite high profile. And they took a risk on me. And literally, we had 11,000 employees at the time, people ops team of about 45, quite manual processes, a big reward agenda, and they made a bet based on the experiences I had, the reference point, the skills she thought I had. And that was a really pivotal moment, straight into a leadership role. I hadn't come through the HR advisor, HR business partner, generalist route. I had limited, systems knowledge, employment law knowledge. I put my first new HR system in sort of 2 years in, which we could laugh about now. It was a legacy IBM system, which really wasn't fit for purpose back in the late 90s. And I had to learn really quickly, Giovanni. And it was a great springboard for me.
Do you think that had an impact on your resilience level and also kind of, adaptability as well, which obviously can have a massive impact, especially if you work with businesses scaling fast or where you're dealing with uncertainty or uncertain times like, we experienced in the last few years?
Yeah, look, adaptability, definitely. I think I learned a lot about myself in that 3 years. I like learning new things. So I'll throw myself into a new area, I'll ask questions, I'll listen, I'll understand how things fit together. And I learned very early that I do have that ability to take on new subjects and new information and adapt. I think resilience is interesting as well, because I think it taught me that actually at times I'm not the most resilient. I think those that have worked with me would say, I spike less on execution capability and implementation. I've always had to put teams around me that can do a great job there. I spike quite high on seeing the patterns and where things join up and connecting themes and people and, so the bigger picture stuff. And I think I learned that very, very early in that 3-year period, especially through the implementation of the HR system. I had to put people around me very quickly
to support you and guide you through the process.
That would guide me through that process, yeah. And again, I did that from my network and people that I'd worked with early in my career.
Also, that's related to kind of, strong level of intuition to kind of say, okay, I understand where I can benefit from some help, support, and I know how I can be successful. And these are the areas where I have gaps and I want to just,
Yeah, and I think that self-awareness has always helped me. I think it's interesting. If I look back on those early years, I was willing to seek out support and help quickly. I was probably less willing to accept those blind spots, if that makes sense. Less comfortable in my own skin. Whereas I think 20 odd years later, I'm pretty comfortable now to say, actually, if you want someone to do this, I'm not your man. Yeah, go find someone else that can spike. This is where I spike. This is where I'm comfortable. So I think that self-awareness was there early, but the ability to be open about that and honest probably takes a little bit longer.
On the point of resilience, uncertainty, dealing with ambiguity, like we went through a massive level of change in the last 4 years, let's say, starting with the pandemic. You need to adjust to operate in a full remote setup, and then a few months later, now we are in hyper growth, and then you go, oh, the market is collapsing. How do we adjust to that? How do we focus on efficiency? Like, there is a massive level of change that happen in people teams, in HR, and for companies in general. Are there any observation that you have around how leadership teams can kind of evolve and adjust in this type of climate and conditions, and any patterns perhaps that you observe in who can be very successful in adjusting to those changes?
I think those leaders that spend more time understanding the challenges in their business and their people and their processes and their teams, rather than trying to look for inspiration from the latest things that are happening in other organisations. I've seen a lot of that the last 3 years, and the most obvious example is that the debate, which is never going to end, around hybrid, return to office, stay at home. And I think quite often people are influenced by their perception of what other companies are doing, rather than starting in their own organisation and talking to their own people. And I think the ones that have been really successful are the ones that have said, actually, what's happening in my organisation? What's happening with my people? How do I need them to work? And what changes do I need to see? So I think start with your own business, start with your own processes, start with your own opportunities, spend time understanding them, and start making the changes there.
What's your view on momentum? Like, in general, you're talking about people, you're talking about, looking at your own company. Like, there is this element of momentum that can be extremely beneficial to drive, the team forward, get excitement, and bring people on board. And I've seen incredible leaders that are to generate even fake momentum when times are rough, to bring people on board in the journey and make them to kind of, push the extra mile to accomplish a goal. Like, what's the role of, this component of momentum creation in a leader, and anything that you observe?
I think it comes back to that first point I talked around generating energy. Momentum is really, really important. I think the challenge is, how do you make it sustainable and authentic, as you say? So I think the best momentum comes from a positive energy around business outcomes and performance. I think about the time at DAZN. The time we had the best momentum and energy is when we were winning new rights, we were entering new markets, we were enhancing our product. We were talking to our customers about new functionality and new features. And I think as long as that momentum has substance, and you can link it to progress, whether that progress is growth, whether it's OKR achievement, whether it's new product functionality, it becomes real. And I think you touched on it. The leaders that are best at that are the ones that are creating outcomes that maintain momentum rather than a narrative which lacks substance. So I think momentum becomes self-fulfilling, and it has to be linked to achievement, business growth, purpose, rather than a sort of pure narrative. Conversely, when I see momentum pause, it is that point where those things start to slow down.
Perhaps there's also an element of like celebration. Like, there's a number of leaders that perhaps don't pause to celebrate, the expectations extremely high. Like, I feel always, oh, we can go faster, we can do better, we can do more. And then you don't pause to kind of, acknowledge what has been accomplished, and then has an impact on perceived momentum, where maybe momentum is there, we are making progress, but we're not actually acknowledging the progress and the momentum. And then there is this perception, oh, we're now moving forward, when actually we are.
Yeah. I think also acknowledging when momentum slows. Why has that happened? what have we learned from it, and that's okay, because you're not always going to be in a period of hypergrowth. I think sometimes stopping to say, actually in the last 2 quarters, growth has not been the same as the previous 3 years, and that's okay. This is why. This is what we've learned in that period. This is what we'll do differently. Because you do reach a point where, in any business, that hypergrowth starts to flatten. And it becomes around, what do you do differently then? What are your new revenue streams? How do you look at tackling different customer cohorts or different groups or a different part of the offer? So I think that's important as well, that you as a leader, you have to recognise that momentum's about demonstrating you're moving forward. It's not always about pace and speed and those big ticket messages. It's just about progress.
We touched on again, effectively the full journey of a leadership team. Like, you identify the skills, you bring the right people on board, you let them execute. Like, the momentum component. And one extra thing they wanted to touch on is basically the end of this cycle, the process. Like, when you realize this, actually, you need to transition out a leader, or a leader, that wants to transition because they believe, okay, this next phase of growth is not right for me. Like, often in, startup scale-up land, we see leaders that want to go from, the 0 to 1 to 10 or whatever kind of, goals, specific goal that you have in mind, and then they're not necessarily the right leaders to kind of, do the scaling part of the journey, but they're more builders. Like, what's your view in general on this transition, which can be also a little bit, challenging and controversial when people see a leader that's been around for a while and he's a kind of, big presence, big figure, and they manage to build up trust and relationship, can be seen as a negative thing for the business. Or things are going bad, there is some missing context that I don't have, they have, like, what's going on, like, drama, fire. What's your view there?
I think the scenarios where I've seen that play out in the best way is where you're almost normalizing those discussions really early in the relationship, Giovanni, between, let's just take the C-suite example, between a CEO and one of his team, that actually early in that relationship, you're already talking about the end, right? And that doesn't mean you're starting day one saying, actually, Gio, you're going to be leaving in 3 years. But I think if you've got an open dialogue around where that individual sees their spikes, the direction they want their career to go, and where they can really help the next stage of that business, but also where it may start to slow down, you almost, that point of making a change, when it's not a surprise that you've both reached that point.
There is an element of say, I'm here because I want to accomplish X, and I know that the moment I manage to accomplish that,
Correct.
we need to start thinking
because
about
the hardest situations are where you get to a point that's a surprise to one person.
Yeah.
Right. So if you reach that point where we've got to change our CMO, and the CMO is absolutely clueless and oblivious to it, it's always going to be a tough change. Yeah. To the point we said earlier. So I think the key for founders and CEOs is thinking about how they build that relationship and trust, where we say, look, there's 3 time horizons to this role. There's the first 6 months, the first 2 years, the next 5 years, and continually talking about that journey. So actually both parties can agree it's time to make a change. And then you can start to plan that transition in a much more measured way. Celebrate the contribution that person's made, because I think that's really, really important. If there's someone that's done a great job for 3 years, but you need a different set of skills, they'll have a team that are committed to them, have been on that journey with them. I think where I've seen it work best, and there's a couple of examples, they're tough to talk about, but I can think of a couple of recent examples where that journey has come to a natural conclusion, but it's been done in a very authentic, measured way where both parties are really happy about the outcome. Yeah. And it helps in so many ways. It helps in terms of succession planning, the transition, how you prepare for that change, because you have some runway. But it also helps for the way the individual leaves.
And as you describe, is a journey, and obviously in every single journey you have an evolution, and perhaps a component of the evolution is also the culture, where we touched on a little bit earlier. Like, different people also have different view of culture. They're a little bit static. Culture, they should evolve. Like, what's your view around culture? I don't know if you have your own definition of culture, but like, how culture should again evolve over time, if should evolve at all or not. I assume so, but you tell me what you think.
Yeah, look, definition of culture. My first view is culture has to be dynamic. I think you can have areas of cultural DNA or principles that can be more static, right? You may say you want an organization to bring curiosity, deliver impact, do the right thing. Some of those active statements that are a sort of anchor, but the culture itself is dynamic because by its very nature, it's an output of the people you have in the organization, the stage of its journey, stage of the journey of the organization, the context of what's happening. What do I think is important with culture? I think it's that you can describe the behaviors that are important, that you want to see from your leaders every day. You have the ability to call out the things that are not helping your organization progress, move at pace. I'm a big believer in you don't put words on a wall.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I think cultural and values and behaviors always have to be active rather than passive. So I love organizations that talk about things like bringing curiosity, doing the right thing. Those sort of passive words around collaboration, they're just wallpaper. Because you can't actively talk about. Everybody goes to work to collaborate and work with each other. So I think cultural journey is around harnessing what are those fundamental elements of organizational DNA that you want everybody to focus on and talk about, and how does that play out in terms of behavior day to day?
On this DNA point, like I've seen a number of companies also doing poorly in a way of evolution of the culture, where you actually kind of removing the component of who we are. Like, what's your view around how do you make sure that our culture is evolving, but as you touched on, this core value principle, the actual DNA of the company, which can be what the funding team is bringing from day one, is actually staying true to the nature of the business. Because we might say, hey, we want to grow a way faster pace. We bring in, I don't know, a new sales leader that has a very different culture, a way different approach. Maybe, we are gently style, and now you get kind of, aggression. How do you make sure that there is not then, creating a very different environment than is, far from the actual nature of the company? Like, I don't know if you've seen anything there, and what's your view?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to something you mentioned earlier. I think the first thing's helping the organization understand the why and the context. And I think organizations aren't always good at that, especially in the scale-up space. And DAZN was a great example of that. I know you had Paul on one of your previous podcasts, but the early days of DAZN was very much around growth, launching new markets, acquiring new rides, gaining more subscribers. Very well-funded business, huge investment from Access Industries and Mr. Blavatnik. And then over time, though, you have to transition that early stage into the things that many businesses face around how do you become more efficient, how do you become more profitable, how do you give your customers a better level of service. And I think one of the key things is giving all of your people more and more context as much as you can as to why you need to make those changes, so at least they can understand. Yeah, and I think organizations aren't always good at that. It comes back to one of your first points around momentum. Yeah. Right? So if you think you've got momentum based on growth and a certain type of culture, which is limitless ambition, we can do anything we want, we can grow, we can enter new markets, with a commercial naivety around it, there's a point where you have to trust your people and take them on that journey and give them context. Your sort of culture anchors can still be the same, but you're saying we have to do this in a different way now. So I think that's a really important part for me, is that you Why? If you tell people why, you've got much more chance of taking them on that journey with you. And equally, back to one of the first points, enabling people to self-select. Back to the early point, I've done the first 3 years of this journey. And actually, I want to go back to an early stage startup now where it is more around innovation, creativity. It is less around execution and efficiency. And that's okay.
How do you normalize that?
I think the first point is to have relationships with your team where you normalize it's okay to talk about those things, which is really tough. There's many times during my career I've helped people leave in my team, and they're really talented people. And by help them leave, it's having that conversation before they become so disengaged and unhappy in their role that you're at a point where they're desperate for a job, they can't find one. You're desperate to make a change. So identifying that early, and it's okay to have that conversation. I'll help you over the next 3-6 months. I'll introduce you to people in my network. We'll have an honest discussion around what is it you want from your next role, without the individual having the fear of, Shaun's going to fire me in 3 weeks' time because I've shared I don't want to be here forever. So I think normalizing it from a leadership perspective, which I think is going to be much more important with future generations of employees as well. We know, all the evidence should suggest much more transient, short-term gigs. The sort of job for life's gone. So it makes those conversations a lot easier to have. So I think that's the first point. Normalize the conversations. It's okay to give 2 great years of my life or 1 great year of my life to this organization. And we can talk about that. I think linked to that then, when you do make those changes, it's about celebrating the work those people have done in your organization, and not, we've all been there where, person X resigns and you're personally hurt, disappointed, they choose to go and do something else. And human nature a lot of the time is to move on quickly, focus on the successor, withdraw them, when actually, I loved the way I left a zone first time around. It was fantastic.
Big party, good, strong celebration.
Yeah, look, I had a fairly long notice period. My then boss made me sort of stick to that notice period, so I think he gave me a month in the end. And what I loved about how he handled that was, he clearly didn't want me to go. He kept giving me work to do for the last 5 months, right? Which not everybody does. He kept pushing, can I get another 2 weeks? Can you finish this piece of work? And then by default, you leave almost by default. The work you've done is celebrated because it's not, you see so many people that are on 5 months notice and they disappear for 3 months and they're not even on garden leave and they're doing 1 day a week. And I laughed. I finished on the Friday and started a Superbet on the Monday.
You no longer join certain meetings.
But in a weird sort of way, that makes the leaving a really good experience because the people around you can see, that leader still trusts you even though you've chosen to do something different. And from a personal perspective, you still feel valued to the minute you leave. And I think that's a much better way of really pushing someone to the line because of the value they bring. And that has a knock-on effect because people recognize that stuff.
Are you worried at all when you look at how the world of work is changing? Like when you look at, careers, 15, 20 years ago, people say at the same company, 10, 15, 20, maybe even more years. And then we've seen the period of 5, 6 years standard, and now new generation, maybe, they change up in 1 or 2 years. What's your view there?
It's a big question. I've got a 6-year-old daughter as well. Look, the last thing you touched on doesn't worry me in the slightest. It excites me, actually. I guess it's the way I've evolved. I spent 1995 to 2007 at Comet. And I loved those 12 years, right? Most of my really close friendships, personally, professionally, all trace back to Comet. It was an incredible culture, great bunch of people. We were trusted, we were empowered. So it was a really important part of my journey. But there's a but coming. But I know I stayed too long. And after I left to go to Compass in 2007, I took a year off, my first year off. I learned so much in the first 18 months.
You realized that there was like too long after. So when you joined the other company, you realized.
I realized I'd spent too long there. Okay. Even though I wouldn't change it.
Yeah.
But I realized from a sort of personal growth perspective, new experience, keeping my brain fresh, new stimulation, new sector. So actually, I'm a massive believer that change is good, and going into different sectors, different organizations, different cultures, different roles, different functions is a good thing, right? Because you bring different perspectives, you bring different ideas. So actually the career for life thing, that really excites me, because I think it's a win for everyone, moving away from career for life into experiencing more things. I think the area that, I don't know if worry is the right word, that I think about more looking at my daughter is the impact of technology on jobs, the impact of AI on the types of work people do and what's automated, and the skills that the future skills that children that are going through school now will need, and what will their careers actually look like. Now that, I don't know if it scares me, but I think about that a lot. I see so much, and we've talked about this. There are so many things that will not be careers or jobs in 2, 5, 10 years' time.
I was in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, and there's plenty of self-driving car, and it's just like insane.
Yeah.
And say, okay, is this the Uber driver, taxi driver is going to be a thing in 5-10 years?
Probably not. And we think of some of my network that have gone for different companies. We think about deliveries. A friend of mine went to work for a startup called Dramatics, looking at cargo-based drones that can do deliveries automated on sort of medium and long haul flights. And I think if I'm being honest, there's some days, if I didn't have a daughter, I think I'd think about it less. It would be interesting. And I think it bumps into things like education and what are the skills we need to equip our children with for the future, and that's a really interesting subject area.
Do you have any advice, suggestion for people listening, leaders listening? Can be broad or anything specific around the culture, leadership, skills specifically, or anything that you think has been beneficial?
Trust and truth. I think whenever I talk about any facet of leadership capability, leadership team dynamics, trust is always a word, culture, that comes up a lot. And I think creating an environment where everything flows from trust. Right? So look at some of the subjects we've talked about today. Being honest about transition points. How long should I stay at an organization? Where can I add value? And I talked about have those conversations early. You can't do that without trust. So I think it's a big focus point for me. Learn from every situation. Context is really, really important. Understand the direction of that business, what it's trying to achieve. Don't be afraid to do something different. And self-awareness is really high as well. I think all the best leaders I've worked with are very high from a self-awareness perspective. Know when it's the right time to do something different.
Helpful. Any suggestion in terms of book resources?
It's interesting. I watched a Netflix documentary about 12 months ago called Stutz. I don't know if you've seen it.
Not familiar with him.
It's about an American psychotherapist who was Jonah Hill's psychotherapist, and he's written 2 books with his co-author Barry Michaels. One's called The Tools, one's called Coming Alive. They're both really great reads that basically talk about why therapy doesn't work and some real action-based strategies to sort of harness your inner potential. So they're really interesting reads if you're in the right headspace to read them. From a business perspective, if I think back to uni and we used to have core texts, I don't recommend loads of books, but my two core texts, The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. I think for anybody that works internationally across borders, it's an incredible sort of bench level of knowledge around cultural differences, and there's 8 different dimensions of culture, and I think it helped me work in Japan, Italy, the US, and get the most out of those relationships. Also helped my personal relationship. I don't think I'm married to a Pole. I think if I hadn't have read the Erin Meyer book, it would have been a lot tougher. Culture Code by Dan Coyle, I think, is just an incredible read. It's 10 years old now, but the stories in there around group dynamics are really, really powerful.
If people want to stay in touch and look where you have to,
Yeah,
channels.
LinkedIn is probably the main place to find me.
Beautiful. Shaun, thanks very much. Massively appreciate you taking the time.
Brilliant. Thanks, Giovanni.